Thank you, Ben. Old Surrey and Burstow Pony Club, the best in the world. Good afternoon, everyone. Are vets failing our horses? I feel somewhat like going to a turkey conference, trying to talk about upping the spirit of Christmas. But what I'll try and do is just provide some thoughts for our discussion and obviously lead into our two other panel presenters. I know James was trying to get some political gags in, and I did desperately try and find jokes about Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn, and was unsuccessful, so I'll just stick with the fact that I will hopefully provide some strong and stable presentational skills with a few messages for the many and not the few. An overview, just in terms of an introduction. My 16-year-old daughter's sitting her GCSEs at the moment, and therefore it's always important to give that parental advice of please read the question. But I thought, just in terms of trying to set a context to today's discussion, what are the parameters that we might measure against when we say, are vets failing our horses, or questioning that? And then, without hopefully treading on the areas that our other two presenters are going to talk about, just to introduce a few areas where I think, maybe we are failing or could be doing a lot better for sure. To give an overview on my personal belief and that of World Horse Welfare, of are we failing our horses as vets? And most importantly, what does it all mean? So just by way of a very brief introduction, as well as being in the Pony Club with Ben, I had the great privilege and honour of going to the same university and the same veterinary school at him. He taught me everything I know. We then did take very divergent paths. Ben went up north and I went to join the British Army to see the world, and I got to Northern Ireland. And I do love Northern Ireland, but I spent 3 years at the Household Cavalry in London, which was an amazing experience. And as Ben says, I've been Chief Exec of World Horse Welfare since 2008. And if my conflicts aren't complete enough, I can declare that I am Treasurer of British Equine Veterinary Association as well, although not, unlike our Chair and other two presenters, a past President of BEVA. So, World Horse Welfare is obviously an international organisation, and I'm certainly not going to talk about our work today, but I just thought it's always important when we're having a discussion focused very much on the UK to set it in context. It's great to see some friends and colleagues from the Brook here, and we obviously work in a developing world, and whilst we have 800,000 to 1 million horses in the UK, or equines in the UK, there are well over 100 million working equids around the world, and I think it's an extraordinary sanitary statistic that we recognise the huge importance that working equids play around the world, and the huge importance that the veterinary profession has globally to fulfil the upwards of 1 billion people who survive on equine power for their very livelihoods. So, what are we measuring against? Let's start with the declaration that we all made, me and Ben, nearly 25 years ago, when we joined the RCVS. And the really important part of this, and I will read it out, my constant endeavour will be to ensure that the health and welfare of animals committed to my care. Now, I think that's a huge undertaking that we took when we joined the Royal College, and I think it, as I mentioned when Tim and I did a similar discussion to the BVA a few years ago, I think maybe as a professional we need to say, how realistic is this today in commercial practice? So that's what we said as vets we were going to do. And then, so if we're talking about equine welfare, and I did make the assumption that since this is the Animal Welfare Foundation and the question was, are vets failing our horses, I focused very much obviously on the welfare aspect. And as we know, if we look in the dictionary, there is, physical and mental health and happiness is a definition of animal welfare. But I think it is really important to recognise today in 2017, what happens to animals and what the public will accept is vastly different to what it was 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago. And I think you only have to look at a sporting spectacle, and a hugely controversial one to some, like the Grand National that's run every April up at Aintree every year, to see the way the fences have changed over the years. And Aintree themselves will recognise actually one of the biggest pressures on them to change that race has been public perception and public pressure. But of course, I think my other bugbear is around welfare, and I think the veterinary profession is partly guilty in this, is when we talk about welfare, we think of people just pampering their horses and being sort of hugging trees and doing things that actually, is seen as nice to haves possibly, whereas welfare is actually fundamental to the responsible ownership, as we've talked about so much this morning. And again, other examples where we know the public view of welfare is changing is, on the issue of using the whip in horse racing. And then to come to that really basic question, is it use, not abuse? Or is use always abuse? And I think, there are, again, sector and indeed some in our own profession are changing around that. Now, obviously, we talked a lot about this morning, but I think the point I just wanted to make was that our understanding of welfare is changing over time too, and from a scientific perspective. We all know, from back in 1965, the Bramwell Report and the 5 freedoms that came out of that through the Farm Animal Welfare Council back in 1979. Now, obviously, this has moved on. It's moved on partly because our understanding of welfare has moved on, but also this is an ideal. We recognise that actually hunger and thirst are important drivers to animals, humans included, to actually going to have food and water. So I think that whole message has moved on, but possibly not in the public's mind. And now we talk about the 5 provisions, and again, we talked a lot about that this morning. And I think it's all around this concept of a life worth living. It's not just freedom from pain and disease, but actually it's looking at positive outcomes for animals as well, and in this regard, equines. And actually, if an animal is shut in a stable 24/7, it may be receiving much of what it's requiring to live, but is it a life worth living? So, what do we think of equine welfare and in terms of vets, and are we failing them? I've listed here a few of the areas that I'm going to go into, but given the size of what Leslie and Tim are going to be talking about, I've put them in brackets, but that means they're no less important. I think end-of-life issues are a huge challenge to the veterinary profession, to animal welfare, and I think the whole issue of supporting performance and horse sport. And whilst personally I'd say I'm a huge advocate of supporting animals to live out longer, happier, athletic careers, there is clearly a line to that. And I think one of the big challenges we face as a veterinary profession is in areas I think we have ceded control to others. And the one example I'd give is, it was about 5 years ago when we were contacted by a young vet who'd been asked to fire horses' tendons. And what should they do about it? And the reality is that he knew that he was being asked by a senior partner to fire those equine tendons, and if he didn't do it, then the vet practice would lose that client and they'd move down the road. But I think if you look in so many yards across the country, trainers now have become in charge of the veterinary care of the animals in their yard and not the vet, and I think that's hugely concerning. So, if we look at weight management, if you look at the statistics, it's anywhere between 30 and 50%. James gave some figures globally. Anywhere between 30 and 50% of the UK equine population is obese or grossly overweight. That's a salutary statistic. Now, clearly, if we're up before a judge, no one will be able to say it is the vet's fault. But I think we can say that as a profession, I think we should be doing a whole lot better to support owners, recognising that this is, as they say, killing horses with kindness. This is not overt cruelty in this traditional sense of the term that we understand, but it is nevertheless having hugely negative impacts on the health and welfare of the animals in our care. And I think, veterinary consultation time is limited, and therefore actually trying to educate horse owners and how to body condition score them, trying to how to put them on effective diets, but also society as a whole. How many equine magazines do you see, or when you go to a horse show, to a judging ring for a showing class, and seeing another obese animal win the class? We face a huge challenge as a profession, and I think it's something that vets have an important role to play. The only other thing I would say around that is that what we know from Wales Horse Welfare experience is that once you have an obese horse, it's a really, really difficult task to get that animal's weight back to where it should be. It's a darn sight easier never to let it get obese in the first place, and I think that's where early intervention is so important. The second area is disease prevention. Again, cause and effect, I totally accept, is nowhere to be proved here. But I think when we have a national equine herd that is in possibly only a vaccination rate of influenza of around 30%, and maybe tetanus a little bit more than that, that is not a good reflection on annual health care for our animals. And how many times do vets go on delivery yards where there are 10, 20, 50, 100 horses and actually talk about basic biosecurity? The UK Equine Disease Coalition, about 3 or 4 years back, has produced an equine health checklist to very much help yard owners implement simple biosecurity measures. And I think that's a real challenge we all face, is that so many people think that biosecurity in the very term requires gold standards. Of course, they're the best way of doing things, but I think a real message we need to promote getting across to equine owners is the more you do, the safer your horses will be. It is not an all or nothing scenario. Then to turn to the area of lameness. Many of you will have seen Sue Dyson's work that she's been doing at the Animal Health Trust, and to see in one study that almost half of sport horses in work were lame. And had been seen by the vet in recent times. So our understanding of lameness, and many might be able to see, and me included, when you're with Sue and she says that horse is lame and you go, I'm glad you can see that because I can't. I appreciate, Sue is hugely qualified, but nevertheless, that is a pretty poor statistic. And I think even more so when we reflected in the fact that with the support of Wales Horse Welfare, Sue has just done some interesting work around equine facial ethograms to see if it can support horse owners and vets actually identify pain just through the facial expressions of that horse. And that, I think, it is a good piece of work. It went to an international veterinary conference for either have a presentation or a poster on it, and the feedback that came back from that renowned international equine veterinary conference was that it was not of enough relevance to the equine profession. I think what an extraordinary response that is. And I do think that, and I know Sue has said it firsthand, that the slightly cynical reflection that she's had, or impressions she's had from many members of the profession when she talks about her work around facial ethograms, is possibly not a positive reflection on the profession. Then to just briefly mention breeding. We talked a lot about breeding this morning, of course, and it is obviously the renowned middle-class disease. If your mare has failed in everything else in life, then why don't you put it into foal? What a great idea. But it's amusing, but sadly, it is so true. Some research we did 3 years ago shows that those who breed 1 or 2 foals in their whole lifetime provide more foals to the UK equine population than those who are professional breeders breeding over 100 a year. So those extra 1 or 2, because tens of thousands of people are doing it, are providing a huge challenge to the overall equine population in the UK. Again, vets don't have the total answers here, but I think we so often are involved at some stage during the decision-making process about whether someone puts their horse into foal or not, and trying to convince them it is going to be a genetic disaster is not always that easy, I fully appreciate. We are, of course, really lucky in this country to have a vibrant animal insurance market. You only have to go to countries around Europe and wider where there is no animal insurance market to show the challenges that they face, not least to the veterinary profession. But of course, it's a twin-edged sword. Many of you'll know a number of the insurance providers for years have been bewailing or bemoaning the rising cost of diagnostics in equine cases and not necessarily seeing the improved prognosis as a result of it. But I think it does create a real challenge for us. Just because we can do something to a horse doesn't mean we should. And equally, just because we have been doing it for years, possibly even decades, doesn't necessarily mean we should go on doing so in the future. So it does come back to when you are working in equine practice, when we are working in equine practice, which is a commercial venture, how easy does that sit with the declaration we all made when we joined the Royal College? And I think this is a rather sort of theoretical question, but I think we need to dwell a little bit more on the implications of modern pressure to vets to be able to better understand it. And what role should vets be playing in promoting good ethics? So, are vets failing our horses? I would say no, but I do think we could be doing a lot better in many areas. I think it's always very dangerous to sit and say we should be doing nothing, we're the best we can get, because I hope many would agree that is simply not the case. So I think just in terms of takeaway messages, do we always prioritise the welfare of our horses over all other considerations? That's a huge undertaking, as I said at the beginning, and I think it's a huge challenge for us. I think when I was asked by the team at the Animal Welfare Foundation about comments today, I think vets often have a bad reputation when it comes to welfare because we certainly do not own animal welfare or equine welfare, but I believe we have a fundamentally important part in supporting and promoting it. There's no doubt if some animal is extremely obese, if someone with three-legged mare wants to put it into foal, these conversations are difficult and they take time. I fully appreciate that. But I don't think we should ever underestimate the potential value those conversations can have over the long term. I think the equine sector, and possibly the veterinary sector too, is conservative with a small c, and I think we should always challenge the status quo. As I said earlier, just because we could or can do something doesn't mean we should be doing it in the future, or indeed if we have been, should we continue so. So what do we mean by the ethical debate? I think the whole idea of ethics, it's moral principles we apply to the use of horses. I think we do use horses, and it's a very direct thing to say, but with use comes responsibility. And I think the issue of responsibility and teaching responsibility obviously is ultimately with the owner of those animals, but the vets have a really important part to play. So I hope that in all of that, I've sort of identified what an important role vets have, equine vets have, in changing owner behaviour over the long time. We are not going to build Rome in a day, but over a few years, then, you know, we might just make a difference. Thank you very much.
Perfect timing, Roly. Thank you very much. Okay, so we've got a couple of questions on Slido. They come in anonymously, but you do have the option of putting your name there. So if you wish to be involved in the debate or respond to Roly's response, then by all means ask the questions with your name on, or put your hand up if we're talking about your question at the time. Roly, so the first question I have here, excuse the semantics slightly, how much of this and all that we're talking about is due to imposter syndrome, i.e. do vets in the field truly believe that they can influence, where's it gone? There we go. Do they believe that we are the experts when discussing the options? So are vets really the true experts, or are we imposters?
Well, they're certainly not the imposters, but maybe if people think that, I think the profession needs to look slightly inwardly before it looks outwardly to show actually maybe we're part of the reason people think that. But I think, and we know from recent surveys, that vets, along with Dr. Google and farriers, are still seen as a hugely important touch points for equine owners. So I think it's an interesting point of partnership, and I know that in many practices the vet-farrier relationship is a really good one, but I think it's even more important now because we know that owners will look to the farrier and their vet as well as the internet, and if the vet and the farrier are agreeing with each other, it's going to make the challenge, the whole, a lot easier.
Yeah, no, I think this person's even more cynical than I am. I mean, we've been to university, we have had lectures in ethics and welfare, and we're out there at the coalface every day, and we are professionals, and we've taken that oath. And Dr. Google hasn't, and all their best friends hasn't, and the district commissioner hasn't. So we are the people to make that choice, I think. Is that the proponent over there?
I should say, whilst we're saying district commissioners, there's one in the audience, Trina Vos, and she's certainly taken a declaration. So we can say that some district commissioners have.
Sorry, imposter syndrome. We went to a seminar here 6 months ago about vet futures. Imposter syndrome is that we're very well qualified. I totally agree with that, but we don't truly believe that we're really qualified, and we're allowing other people to occupy our space as the experts in there because we don't have the confidence in ourselves.
I think I totally understand. And I suppose that all comes back to day one skills and giving our new vets the confidence to be able to go out and do that, because we do know that horse owners are very opinionated and it's quite easy to get downtrodden by them. But I think, nonetheless, I think on one level it's really important we're not arrogant and being seen as the know-it-alls, and of course it's our right to be able to decree advice. But on another level, I couldn't agree more. We cannot shy away from it either.
Good. Glad that we cleared that up. Another one on Slido, another anonymous one. Is trainers being increasingly responsible for veterinary care not an example of the veterinary profession choosing financial gain over following their oath?
I think, I'm sure in certain cases that is true, but as ever, there's a range. But I do think that, and I've seen it firsthand, that again, some trainers like owners can be very opinionated and very demanding. And I think, especially when you know, if you don't do as the trainer wants you to do, they'll just up sticks and go down the practice down the road. That is a real commercial conundrum. But I think just because there's a risk of that doesn't mean we shouldn't be talking about it and being more open about where that balance fits. And if you look at, I was speaking to someone from the States the other day, an example over there, they 30 years ago said they wanted nothing to do with equine dental technicians. So, the veterinary profession in the US ceded that across to non-vets. And I think, that is and they recognise now that's a hugely damaging to the health and welfare of equines, but also to the veterinary profession. And I think we need to be very mindful of that.
I think so, and I think the key to that is communication and the code of conduct, and we must communicate with each other. And it is a little bit dog out there in the equine veterinary market, and we need to remember who we are. Okay, the next question. Why do owners appear so difficult to talk to and persuade, with a worse reputation than small animal owners? Is it the association of horse and money?
I think that's probably a little bit of a cynical view. I think there's lots of owners who are very easy to persuade, but there are some really challenging ones. But just because you have a challenging owner, and I do caveat with the fact that I sit at Welltall's Welfare and don't have to deal with clients every day, and I recognise this is not an easy thing to do, but just because they are demanding and overbearing doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing our utmost to actually provide the best advice that we can. And if that takes more time talking about the weight of their animals than whatever particular syndrome they're wanting you to chat about, that is what is incumbent upon us. That's the declaration that we made.
I think so. I'm not sure it is the money. And the most difficult clients I deal with in terms of communication are the less moneyed and the less well-educated, I'd have to say. And persuading them to just believe in a professional is the hardest task I have. And it's easy when they've got a bit of money. It's easier. They might not listen, but they understand. Any points? Right. Next one. How many human athletes would be sound?
Well, actually, that's a really
Not on drugs.
Well, of course, there was something on Radio 4 the other night, actually, about the widespread abuse of non-steroidal anti-inflammatories in human athletes, because there is no, they can take as many as they like. I mean, it's an allowed substance under WADA rules. And I think that is a time bomb for the future generations. So I think it is a huge issue. And I think it's something, until my own personal view, until the international authorities actually take a view on that and bring in and regulate it, it will be open season. And I think we know that was talked about this morning. I think James talks about, if you set the standard here, then there are always going to be a proportion of people who try and step over that line. But if there is no line, then you can just imagine what abuse people are doing to their bodies in the name of winning a gold medal.
Thanks very much, Roly. I mean, I think this will be discussed a bit more after Tim's talk. But one of my concerns with the FEI rules and the BHA rules in terms of medication is knowing detection times almost creates a culture of equine sports owners wanting medication because they think it improves their animals, and that's quite an issue for the equine practitioner at the moment.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Roly.